There are so many names up on the windows on Main Street, people who contributed to the overall development of the Magic Kingdom and the Walt Disney World Resort. I wanted to continue to share them with you. And here's part 2, where we go along the side where the Emporium is, up that side. A couple of quick caveats about the windows on Main Street. These have been there since 1971. Sometimes they're down for repairs. They're otherwise obscured. Sometimes they've moved or otherwise changed. It does happen. And when I'm giving you an overview of who the person is, sometimes I can't find the biography of that person. So just bear with me. We start over by the barn and where we see 2 windows. The first is dedicated to Roger Broggie, who was this mechanical genius who could build anything. He built many of the trains and many of the wheeled vehicles you see around and helped Walt with the Carrollwood and Pacific Railroad. The second window is dedicated to Owen Pope. Pope, along with his wife Dolly, helped procure most of the animals and train them, including the horses that draw the carriage in the Magic Kingdom. Up is a trio of windows dedicated to music around the Walt Disney World Resort. The first is dedicated to Bob Jackman, who wrote a number of scores that you've heard around and also had voiced Goofy at some point, which is kind of an intriguing subplot. Second is the window for George Bruns. George wrote some of the music you hear around the parks, but is most notable for having worked with Exitencio on the Pirates of the Caribbean theme song. And as we kind of work our way around the window a little bit more, we'll see the third person, and that's Buddy Baker. Baker was responsible for a lot of the music that the Sherman Brothers didn't write, so a lot of things you're familiar with, including the Haunted Mansion songs. In another musical tribute, Ron Logan was actually responsible for creating all of the live music performances you see around the Walt Disney World Resort. Lonnie Lindley was responsible for creating much of the paint schemes and a lot of the different color palettes that you see on different buildings. And Ed Bullard was the first director of Walt Disney World Security. He set up the security profiles, and a lot of it extends into what we see today. Charles Corson was responsible for casting the Dapper Dans, all of the performers you saw in different places that were live on stage. Robert Janney was responsible for overseeing the productions, including the Main Street Electrical Parade, to make sure it came together seamlessly. One of the things I still haven't quite figured out is why most of the windows above the Emporium along Main Street have no names on them. There's no dedications on any of them. There are many on the other side. There are a lot in the corner, but there are really none as you walk along the Emporium on the main part of the street there. It's really kind of interesting that they didn't use any of them for dedications or other references to anything in the past. Emile Curry had won 2 Academy Awards for set design. But what he did for the Disney company was in the same genre, where he would create these different sets so you felt like you were immersed in something. Charlie Ridgway was the director of press and publicity at the soon-to-open Walt Disney World Resort. He was there to make sure that it got all the right press attention, and he helped decide who the opening day first guests were. The next set of windows is dedicated to some of the technical geniuses, the wizards at Walt Disney World. The first is Joyce Carlson, who created some of the 3D characters like in It's a Small World and the Haunted Mansion. The second is dedicated to the little gremlins, the people who made things, who physically made them. So that would be Bob Booth, Roger Broggie Jr., and John Franke. And the third is dedicated to some mechanical geniuses who did a lot for the Walt Disney World Resort. Clockwise from the top left, you have Neil Gallagher, Jack Gladish, Rudy Pena, Dave Schweininger, Dick Van Every, and Jim Verity. And they were called MAPO because money came in from the Mary Poppins movie and was able to fund a lot of the activities that they had going on.
Slide until the Dapper Dans pass.
Next up is another group of 3 windows dedicated to a series of Imagineers. On the first window, you have Maury Hauser, Lou Jennings, and John Joyce. They each had some role in developing the Walt Disney World Resort in terms of design and construction. Now, I'm not sure what that was exactly, but they are interesting in the history of the parks. On the other hand, the middle window is dedicated to Don Edgren and John Wise, who were both engineers who were established working as contractors at Disneyland and were ultimately hired to come and work for the Disney parks as they were building Orlando. So then you have the third window, which lists 3 more Imagineers, Ken Klug, Stan Maslek, and John Zovich. Now, the 3 of them each had some work that they did within it. Zovich is the only one we really know anything about. He was a creative show designer and did a lot of construction work around some of these shows. Next up is a window dedicated to the human dynamo calculating machine, the 2 people who were responsible for the financials of the Walt Disney World Resort. That would be the CFO in Michael Bagnall, who was responsible for all of the financial picture and what was happening, reporting up to the bigger company. And then I believe it was his assistant was named David Snyder, who was there working on the financial picture as well. So the 2 of them really combined to tell us what the financial operating principles looked like.
But I never could have tractor.
A little corner in what used to be Center Street is Robinson's Repairs, dedicated to Cecil Robinson, who ran the facilities operation for all of the Walt Disney World Resort. The windows dedicated to Jack Lindquist are a little bit obscured. They're hard to see from Main Street, but they're related to him being the chief marketing officer for the Walt Disney World Resort when it first opened. This next window is dedicated to McPhee, Larson, Rivers, and Holmes, who were executives, and this was actually added in 2021, so it's a new addition. And then, of course, right next to it is the Meg Crofton window that was also added fairly recently. And now we move to a window that's a little hard to see, but it's kind of relevant and one of those important ones. When you read it, it says, Big Wheel Company, one of a kind, horseless carriages and unicycles, and it's a tribute to all of the Imagineers who created ride vehicles throughout the Disney parks. So we start with Dave Gegenbach, who you might recognize as someone who was responsible for a lot of the vehicles throughout there. We move on to Bob Gurr, who's a legend. Bob Gurr had a lot to do with the development of the monorail and the cars that are over at the Autopia, or whatever they call it these days, the Tomorrowland Speedway. Then we have George McGinnis, who designed a number of ride vehicles, and he was the last Imagineer that Walt personally hired, so he has this interesting connection to Walt Disney in that sense. And then you have Bill Watkins, who was responsible for a number of ride vehicles, including the Space Mountain cars that were in use. So kind of an interesting collection of people who created a lot of the ride and show vehicles that we know. And right next to it is a window giving tribute to Earl Vilmer. Great steam power. He's the person who procured all of the steam trains that are in use in the Magic Kingdom. Further over are a few windows that are relative to people who were executives with the company, starting with Card Walker. Alienist, practitioner of psychiatry, and justice of the peace. Of course, Card became the CEO of the Walt Disney Company after Roy Disney stepped down and oversaw the opening of Epcot. Al Weiss was the president of worldwide operations for Disney Parks and the head of the Youth Athletic League, where he was preparing youngsters for the game of life, which I guess could be construed as a sort of an inside joke. Ted Kroll, who was the Main Street Waterworks control system specialist, he was responsible for creating all of the queues as we know them today and sort of that mindset of how we think about queues, and oversaw all of the facilities at Walt Disney World. Arnold Lindbergh worked under him and was the technical director of all of the workshops that made everything work at Walt Disney World.
Next up, we see the big top theatrical company with 4 Imagineers listed here as well. These were Imagineers who worked on a number of rides and shows that you know around. Claude Coates was most notably responsible for all of what happened in the Haunted Mansion. Mark Davis was an animator, a great mind when it came to putting together a lot of these things, and he designed up most of the visual effects you see at the Pirates of the Caribbean. John Decour was the person who was responsible for some of the architectural parts of what you see, like Cinderella's castle. And then Bill Justice was an animator who did a lot of drawings of what was expected in many of the pavilions and things that were created around the Walt Disney World Resort. Above Casey's Corner, Chinese restaurant, fine food, imported tea, is a reference to Jim Armstrong, the person who was responsible for food service and setting all of that up at Walt Disney World. And now let's go around the corner and look at things that are on the other end of Casey's Corner. Above this side of Casey's Corner, we see the Merchants Hotel, and these signs are a little hard to read, but these are people who were responsible for running the hotels that Disney set up. It's Merchants Hotel, first class particular, steam heat throughout. Howard Rowland, John Curry, and Stan Garnes. They're all people who were responsible for setting up how the hotels ran. Next up is the Camelot Corps, roadshow installations featuring 4 Imagineers, Tony Baxter and Dave Perkart, shown here, Ed Johnson and Gary Younger, and these are all Imagineers who joined the company much later. And finally, we have the Ralph Kent collection. Ralph was an artist who worked for the Walt Disney Company. And that takes us to the end of the journey toward the end of Main Street here. Now, in the next video, I'm going to go around the other side of Main Street, from Center Street up to the end, facing the castle.